Last year, we saw a historic number of Georgia players drafted. 15 players, 5 of them went in the first round. And this year, much of the same, led by defensive lineman Jalen Carter. Some now calling him the top prospect in this year's draft. A 300-pound absolute force, first-team All-American, 29 quarterback hurries, 3 sacks, 7 tackles for loss, and 2 forced fumbles. And Ryan Wilson, our draft expert, now has him the second player drafted, going number 2 overall to the Browns. Taking a look at Ryan Wilson's latest mock draft, which, by the way, you can find at CBSSports.com. 2 Georgia players going in the top 10. You see Keely Ringo there, 6th overall to the Lions, but he does have 5 in the first round, much like last year. So let's welcome in our draft expert, Ryan Wilson here. Ryan, 5 Georgia players in the first round last year. You have that many going again this year. What are the chances we actually see that happen?
Feels like it's pretty good, Amanda, and you've already heard me talk about these players so many times that I feel like you could be the draft expert at this point. Guess what? It's only early January. We still got 3.5 months to go to talk about these kids. So Jalen Carter at the top there, 2nd overall. Does that seem like a surprise? Not really, because the difference is the quarterback will probably go number 1 if you're the Texans. And then after that, do you want Jalen Carter, who plays interior in the defense, or do you want the edge rusher Will Anderson? And it just depends on what you're looking for when you're drafting those players. Both fantastic football players. Both are going to translate to probably game changers the moment they step on an NFL field. But Jalen Carter on the inside, you mentioned the 5 Georgia players who were drafted last year in round 1, all defensive players. Jalen Carter could end up being better than all of those guys once it's all said and done. Yes, he looked a little winded at times in the Ohio State game, but he also was a difference maker when he flipped the switch, and perhaps that'll be some questions that NFL teams ask when he does flip the switch and when perhaps he looks like he's a little gassed. But at the end of the day, he is an absolute special talent, and I suspect we will see a lot from him on Monday night in the championship game because big players show up on the big stages, and that'll be a chance for Jalen Carter to shine one last time before he presumably takes his game to the next level.
And we have seen a lot of arguments. You and I and Brady Quinn, Danny Cannell were here. Danny said, look, if I'm sitting at number 2, I'm taking Will Anderson. Brady said, I am taking Jalen Carter, no doubt. Let's move on to Stetson Bennett. Look, he has been overlooked up until a point his entire career, former walk-on, now national champion. Look, we're at the draft. He is 25 years old. But what are you actually hearing from scouts or teams? Do we see him get drafted? Where do we see him get drafted?
That's going to be the fun conversation, right? Because coming into the season, he was the prototypical college football game manager. We know his story. He's played at Georgia for forever. He transferred left, came back into community college, so on and so forth. But he has been balling out. Now, look, he's 5'11". He's listed at 186, so he's probably smaller than both of those. But he finds ways to make plays, number 1. And number 2, he's a fantastic leader. His teammates believe in him, and he finds ways to make plays in critical situations. That doesn't necessarily mean he's going to go in the top 100. In fact, he is not going to go in the top 100, and it'll be fun to watch. Will he get drafted at all? And I think there's an opportunity for him to go in the later part of the draft, round 7, if a team needs someone that they want to bring in, that they want to compete during training camp, that they want to have a spot on the practice squad with the understanding that they could come in an injury situation and start a game or 2 or 3 for you at the next level and understand the offense, understand how the offense is supposed to be run, and try to execute the offense to the best of their abilities. That is going to be Stetson Bennett's place at the next level, it feels like. I mean, look, I could be wrong. Maybe he's the next Tom Brady. But as we sit here, that's how NFL teams are viewing him, and I think he has an opportunity to get drafted late, but he's not going to be a guy who's going to come in out of Georgia like, say, a Matthew Stafford and be a first-round can't-miss talent. But I think there's certainly a place at the next level for Stetson Bennett, and I wouldn't be surprised, because we've seen it before, if he absolutely balls out on Monday night, because that's been his MO the last 2 years in Athens for the Bulldogs.
Ryan, is he one of those players who's just going to say, hey, look at the tape, or is he going to go through the motions leading up to the draft?
Yeah, I think he'll be a guy that goes through the motions. I think his whole MO, his CV, his resume, if you will, has been, I will prove to you that I'm better than you say that I am because you're underestimating me because I'm 5'11", 186. He hasn't gotten a Senior Bowl invite just yet, I don't believe, but I wouldn't be shocked if that's down the pipe, or if he goes to the Shrine Bowl or goes to some All-Star game and continues the process of trying to prove himself through the draft process. Because, again, we've seen what he's done for the best team in college football for perhaps 2 years in a row. We'll find out Monday night. And I think he'll have an opportunity to continue to prove himself. And don't be confused. Just because the college football season is over except for one more game, that doesn't mean NFL teams aren't viewing these players in a fluid manner. And by that I mean they're not penciled in to be undrafted or a sixth-round pick. There are things that Stetson Bennett, that Max Duggan can do to continue to improve their draft stock based on how they go through the final game of the college football season, of course, and then once we get to the All-Star games and the pre-draft process in general.
Things start to change very quickly. Let's talk about a guy from TCU here. We're talking about wide receiver Quentin Johnson. Look, last year we did not have a single player from TCU drafted at all in any of the rounds. Right now you have him going in the first round, and you actually like him a little bit better than Jordan Addison. Why?
Yeah, that's a fun fact, Amanda, that no TCU player was drafted last year, and now they're playing in the national title game, and they're going to have a handful of guys drafted. But the surefire first-round pick is going to be Quentin Johnson, and I like him a little bit more than Jordan Addison, who is a great player in his own right, because Quentin Johnson's 6'4" and about 220, and he wins consistently deep down the field, as you see here, and that's no surprise given his size and his speed. He's a great contested catch guy. He has a huge catch radius, which is great if you're drafting a wide receiver for a young quarterback in the NFL, and I have him going to the Texans at pick 12 in my latest mock draft after the Texans take Bryce Young first overall. So that's a weapon for Bryce Young there. But the other thing that I love about Quentin Johnson is that in small areas, getting off the line of scrimmage, getting into his breaks 5-10 yards down the field, he moves like he's a much smaller receiver. By that it means he's shiftier, he's quick out of his breaks, he creates separation. Things that you see smaller wide receivers like Jordan Addison do consistently, but things that you see bigger wide receivers struggle with just because of their size. So I think given that, it's going to be a fun conversation to have as we go through this process. Is Addison number one? Is Quentin Johnson number one? For me, it's Quentin Johnson. I know that Brady Quinn likes Jordan Addison. I know a lot of NFL teams do as well. And it'll be something for us to talk about as we get through this thing.
And even though you like Johnson, right now you do have him going just one spot behind Jordan Addison. You have Jordan Addison 11th overall to the Titans. Johnson, as you mentioned, 12th overall to the Houston Texans after they go ahead and draft Bryce Young, which would be incredible for them any given way. All right, let's talk about Max Duggan here. Look, similar to Stetson Bennett, he's an underdog story. He had that heart condition. He began this season as the backup, earned that starting job in the first game of the season. He still has another year of eligibility. Do we see him go to the draft? If he does, where could we see him taken?
Well, he was invited to the Senior Bowl, and he accepted it, and he doesn't necessarily have to honor that if he chooses to return, but I would imagine he's probably on his way to the NFL. We'll find out together after Monday's game. But you're exactly right. So he wasn't even the starter to begin the year. And one of the things that stuck out to people about Max Duggan is that he said, if I'm not the starter, I'll be the best backup, the best teammate I can be. And it sounds hokey, but NFL teams take notice of that. And then, of course, he won the job, and the rest is history as we sit here with one game left to go. Look, he was a day 3 guy all day long throughout the course of the season. The last 2 games has gotten people's attention in the league. And on the With the First Pick podcast that I do with Rick Spielman, the longtime Vikings general manager, he's taken notice and said, wait a second, we may need to go back and sort of reevaluate Max Duggan. He's a day 3 guy probably, but maybe he goes earlier than we imagine. I don't know if he slips into day 2 just yet, but you saw the clips there. He can push the ball down the field. It helps if you're throwing to Quentin Johnson, but he has good arm strength. He can win with his legs consistently, which is what we need a lot of these NFL quarterbacks to do now, and he's a fantastic team leader. And, you know, again, that sounds hokey on some level, but you can't underestimate what it means for a young man to step into the huddle and have the respect of his 10 teammates in there with him. And Max Duggan has shown that time and time again as we've seen TCU make their way to the final. So I think he's going to be a day 3 pick. The question becomes, is he going to be a 6th rounder, for example, or will he end up going early in round 4 because teams like the value that he adds, the physicality that he brings, and the ability to grow into that role once he learns an NFL offense.
Ryan, you mentioned your podcast there with the first pick. It is new for you. We're going to promo that. We're going to throw up the full screen. But tell me, as this full screen pops up, how is it going? How are you liking doing this podcast?
It is fantastic. Number 1, to take a break from Will Brinson. Number 2, to work with Rick Spielman, who has so much experience and so many great stories. On the last podcast, he talked about the Vikings' decision to draft Harrison Smith and went through all that. So please listen if you haven't yet. I got to pay my bills and send my kids to college.
Ryan Wilson, we appreciate it. Do you want a sports network that delivers everything that matters about the game? The highlights, the picks, the instant analysis, no yelling, no fake debates, no politics. Hit the subscribe button and never miss a moment.